now I would like to introduce Dr. Simon Curtis with his keynote speech, as well as Tomasz Kamiński as the moderator of the first panel discussion. Please go ahead.
Just a few words to introduce Professor Simon Curtis. As Joanna already said, he is an associate professor at University of Surrey in England, close to London. He did his PhD at London at LSE, and his supervisor was famous Professor Barry Buzan. And in some sense, Simon Curtis follows steps of his supervisor, trying to look for not obvious connections between things in IR. And one of those not obvious connection is connection between cities and global order, and cities and Belt and Road Initiative, for example. And this will be a topic of his today's speech. The speech will be based on the brand new book about Belt and Road and cities. I'm reading this book. It's very good and very not very much academic, so approachable and easy to read. So I encourage you to look at the book as well. Yeah, I think that's it, Professor. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Thomas, and thank you for your kind invitation to be here, and thank you very much also for organising this really nice event. I know that a lot of work goes into organising these things, so that is very much appreciated. Yeah, so the theme of my talk today is going to be on the theme of the talk today is going to be in search of the Belt and Road City. And I'll say a little bit in a little while about what I mean by this search for the Belt and Road City. This is a theme on, as Thomas just mentioned, a book that I've recently published, just in the last few months actually, with a colleague of mine, Ian Klaus, at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in California. So we wrote that book together. And the book examines what China has been doing over the last 10 years with the Belt and Road Initiative in terms of its investment in infrastructure across Eurasia and Africa, and also in the way that it has been influencing urban development. And so the book traverses many countries, many regions, looking for the impact of the Belt and Road Initiative in many different places, in many different contexts. But its core argument is not just about the Belt and Road Initiative, or indeed just about Chinese grand strategy, although it does also touch on those topics. It has a broader, I would say more universal theme, and that theme is the nature of international order. And perhaps that we have failed to properly understand the nature of international order, and how international orders are historically built, constructed, and endure across space and time. So that is the key kind of underlying argument. And I would say that international relations as an academic discipline has tended not to see the impact of cities and infrastructure. It is something that is largely invisible to the discipline. And I think that's a mistake. And by doing this, by not seeing these dynamics, we are failing to see how international order is created and how it is transformed. And we also have an incomplete understanding of power and how it works and how it is built and how it endures across time and across space. So the book is essentially looking at the material components of international order at a variety of scales. And these could be very tiny urban fragments, they could be individual buildings, they could be squares, they could be marketplaces, to whole cities and the way cities are laid out and planned or develop, or systems of cities within nations or across transnational spaces, to huge urban corridors, huge transnational urban corridors, and these actually are at the root of much of what the Belt and Road Initiative is trying to do, as I will go on to discuss, to continent-spanning or globe-spanning large technical systems. And so the idea here is that we have to look at these things at a variety of different scales, and that they are integral components of international order, just as norms and values and institutions are also integral components of international order. And so in many respects, international relations over the last 3 to 4 decades has taken a linguistic turn, where the dominant theoretical frameworks are things like social constructivism, largely, to a lesser extent, maybe postmodernism. But in taking that direction, in taking that route, the materiality of the international system has been lost to some extent. And I'm not going to suggest that those things are not important. Of course they are. But what I also want to suggest here is that we have to think about the entanglement of the social and material components of international society and international order. And Thomas mentioned my old supervisor, Barry Buzan, who of course very instrumental in the English school notion of international society, and building that in his career, and going on from people like Hedley Bull and Adam Watson, and the historical international societies that have endured. And in many respects, although I diverge quite a lot from the kind of ways in which I'm thinking about international societies now and trying to bring back these material components, these ideas do come out of that legacy of people like Hedley Bull and people like Barry Buzan, and people that continue to work in that kind of English school perspective, but as well as many others, because my argument is that those ways of thinking about international society, as I said, are incomplete. So, I know that many of you in this room are regional specialists, and I'm sure, no doubt, that you have far greater knowledge of China and its regions and those areas than I do. But what I'm hoping to offer then is this kind of interesting perspective that is slightly different, that shows how China's efforts to re-engineer international order with the Belt and Road Initiative have focused on infrastructure and urban development. And in this sense, what China is doing, I think, is trying to remake the world, remake the global economy, the configuration of international order from within. And this, I think, is an important argument to make, because in many ways, this is a necessity for China, given the current distribution of power. So the liberal international order that has defined probably the international system since the end of the Second World War, certainly expanded after the Cold War, is itself a form of structural power. And yet we are now, as we know, in a period of great transformation, one of great tension. And this is one of those rare historic moments when we have a dissatisfied and revisionist power that is also rising within the configuration of an international system that it has not shaped for historical reasons, and that the balance of power is in flux. And as IR scholars, we know that in many of these periods in the past, often such moments have led to wars of hegemonic succession. And many fear today this idea of the Thucydides trap, that in relation to the US and China, that there will be such a conflict as one large power, great power, rises within the context of an international order that it is dissatisfied with. But what I would argue with the Belt and Road Initiative is actually China is cutting an alternative pathway, one that we perhaps haven't seen clearly before, and is wielding influence by connecting the forgotten places and the gaps and the interstitial sites of the current order. So the Belt and Road Initiative is also one of these rare historical moments when we as scholars can observe the creation of international order and the literal construction of new connections and the redrawing of old ones happening before our very eyes. And so this is a rare historical moment, and one that I'm not sure that we're privileged to watch it happen, because it's one of great tension, but at the same time it's one that we can view. Now, the other thing to say about this notion of the Belt and Road City that we talk about in the book, and here I said at the beginning that I want to talk about what I mean by the Belt and Road City. We are not using the Belt and Road City as a description of a particular city or set of cities that exist in the world today. We are using it as a concept. as a kind of heuristic device, if you like, to try to pick out the links between the rise of a great power, infrastructural development, urban life in many different settings, and the changing nature of international order. And so for us it functions as a concept to try to make visible the things that I talked about earlier as being invisible in international relations. And in this way, I would argue, in many ways, it functions as a concept much in the way that the global city is a concept as well. You know, we are very used to the idea now of a global city, but it emerged as a concept. It emerged with people like Saskia Sassen making theoretical arguments about the changing nature of globalization and the emergence of transnational networks and all of those things that we associate with global cities. And as Thomas said earlier, you know, I spent a large part in my early career looking at global cities. And I know that many people in this room also have looked at global cities and transnational networks and sub-national diplomacy and all those kind of subjects. But one of the things that I was very interested in a previous book that I wrote was the relationship between global cities and US hegemony and, again, a particular distribution of the balance of power. And the argument in that book was all of these things that we observed, you know, that we see with the changing nature of cities, the way they're playing bigger roles on the world stage, the way that they're making these durable transnational networks, they're utilizing the internet and digital technology, they're involved in complex forms of global governance. I argued in that book that that was only possible in a kind of international society or international order which was underpinned by a liberal hegemonic power, underpinned by the United States, essentially. And so there's an intrinsic connection between the world of global cities and the networks that they form, the world economy, liberal values and ideas, and US power. And of course, it's no coincidence that in the 1990s, this was the period when the global city really expanded and came to people's attention. And you could argue that perhaps that period is coming to an end. I was talking to Dominic a little bit about this before the session. And, you know, since 2008, since the global financial crisis, and then, of course, with the US kind of, you know, let's say, less confident in liberal internationalism than it has been in the past, we could say that that period of the global city may be bookended to some extent from the sort of, you know, 1970s to 2008, and we're in a world where we're not quite sure what is happening, and we're in a world where there's a return of great power conflict and great power geopolitics. But so the point I'm trying to make here is that moving on to this idea of the Belt and Road city is a way of thinking about those connections in relation to Chinese power and the way that it's been unfurling and extending across the world in the last decade. So in search of the Belt and Road city means using this concept to find these connections. Okay. Now I've done similar kind of talk to this around the book in different settings. And in some of those settings, it's necessary to describe what the Belt and Road Initiative is because many people don't know, right? But I'm guessing in this room that everybody is pretty familiar with it. So I'm not going to go into great detail, but just a few kind of notes here on the emergence of the Belt and Road Initiative, because we're now in the second decade of this project, right? And it was launched in Astana in Kazakhstan in 2013 by President Xi. And then there was a later launching of the maritime Silk Roads in Jakarta in Indonesia in October 2013. And Xi, when he announced it in his speech, he talked about his home province of Shaanxi being right at the starting point of the ancient Silk Roads. And he said, today, as I stand here, I look back at that episode of history, and I can almost hear the camel bells echoing in the mountains, see the wisp of smoke rising from the desert. And of course, the point of this is that, you know, China has heavily tied the Belt and Road Initiative to the memory of the ancient and medieval Silk Roads. And one of the reasons that it has done this, I think, is because it looks to this period as a period before the rise of the West. You know, before Westphalian international order, the world, and going back to, you know, our old friend Barry Buzan talks a lot about this in his International Systems in World History. We have to think about international systems as you know, being products of history, products of different historical periods, taking different configurations in different historical periods. And of course, China is looking to a period of history when it was the big player, when it was, you know, the center often of a lot of historical tributary systems people talk about. And there are many echoes, we can maybe talk about this later in the day, in the sessions, of the way in which past international systems were configured in this kind of transnational tributary structure that are very different to the ones in which we've had since the Peace of Westphalia under the rise of US power. And so there's a complex historical kind of set of arguments going on here, but China really likes to push this narrative of the Silk Roads because it is a time in which China is seen as at the heart of an international society, an international community in which it provided leadership and wisdom and development for other states. And it likes, I think, to have that historical memory as it moves in uncertainly into a future which it wants to look quite different in terms of international order than the one that we currently have had and we have had for the last 80 years. So I think that's important. And of course the maritime route is also important as well, because the Silk Roads, the main kind of elements of them are the overland economic belts and then the maritime routes that it has. So it's trying to build these things out. And so this is a map from the book that shows you the 6 key overland economic belts that China is building, and the maritime Silk Road there in the dots that you can see connecting different ports, maritime ports, that it is investing in heavily and bringing all of these things together, component by component. So this is a hugely ambitious investment program in infrastructure. It takes in roads, it takes in railways, so those sort of very traditional elements. It takes in ports. It also takes in energy, and China talks a lot about its own notion of an ecological civilization, which we might say is part of the geopolitics of net zero. It also has a digital component, which I think is very important. So we're talking about the laying of new submarine internet cables and infrastructures. We're talking about data centers and those kind of things. We're talking about smart cities and smart city solutions. It finds its expression in cities, in urban forms, and these big urban corridors that I talked about. It is at the moment something that touches over 160 countries around the world. And one of the things that China has latched onto, that someone like Jane Jacobs, you know, the famous urban thinker would have said in the past, is the power of urban agglomeration for economic development. So it wants to build these big urban corridors because it thinks urbanism and urban agglomeration is at the heart of economic development. And again, as I said, Jane Jacobs made those kind of arguments in the 1960s in the US context. In the first 10 years, people talk about a figure in the region of $1 trillion invested in infrastructure. Originally, 8 trillion was projected. Some of these figures are quite sketchy and difficult to really sort of get clear. What we know, of course, is that the Chinese economy has slowed down in recent years, and many of the sort of grander ambitions of the Belt and Road Initiative have been scaled back a little bit. There's been some bad experiences that China and its partners have had in some of these investments. And so China is being more cautious in the future. But I don't think the Belt and Road Initiative is going to go away. It's written into the Chinese constitution. And I would argue that it is, you know, what I'm arguing in this talk is that the Belt and Road Initiative essentially is the material infrastructure of China's play to transform the nature of international order. And so therefore it can't go away. And the other thing to note about this that I would argue as well, and we talk about in the book, is that if you are going to generate a successful international order, if you are going to materialize your own domestic values and ideas in the world, and they're going to take root, then they have to be expressed in material form, in cities or in infrastructures of different types. And so originally the Belt and Road Initiative was talked about a completion date, if you can ever complete such a sort of amorphous and huge project, as being 2049. And of course, that is the centenary of the Chinese Communist Party taking power, of course, taking control after the Chinese Civil War. And This is seen as a kind of, tying historically into the journey of the Chinese Communist Party. So here's just some visuals of the great sort of train networks that have been built out, the roads that are being built, the energy infrastructures, the digital Silk Road, which is also playing out in the institutions of places like the United Nations, where China is pushing its own internet standards and protocols and these kind of things, and the maritime routes and the shipping networks that we have emerging. And so there are 6 of these big economic corridors. The one that is unusual in the fact that it only traverses one country is the China-Pakistan economic corridor, which is number 4 here on the map. And that is that's a visual of that one in more detail. And you'll see all of these different infrastructural components going down from Kashgar in China, linking up to the new city port of Gwadar city near Karachi in the south, out into the Arabian Sea. This is another map from the book, and this shows the railway construction that China has been involved in the last 10 years, linking logistically lots of new cities together, shaving off journey times for the movement of goods across Eurasia into Europe, also a lot of railway construction in Africa and the east coast of Africa. And then these dotted lines here are the new fiber optic cables that China has been laying. Huawei Marine has been a big player in this, so it's using its state-owned or national champions to develop these infrastructures. And so this is, as I said, a vast project of connectivity that's been going on over the last 10 years. So what is it that's driving the Belt and Road Initiative? We can describe what it is, but we also need to know what is driving it. And here you get a number of different arguments in the literature. And I think, there's an element of truth to all of these arguments, and they're not especially sort of mutually exclusive. So people talk about it being a branding exercise, this notion of the new Silk Roads that I talked about earlier. There is no doubt that these are, hundreds of disparate projects in all different parts of the world. Their scale and scope is actually sort of breathtaking when you really look at it. This is, in many respects, the Silk Road narrative is something that is tying these projects together and making them sound more coherent than they really are. So in that sense, it's a kind of branding exercise. People talk about this being a spatial fix. So of course China, like many other great powers rising in the past, has accumulated an enormous amount of capital, and it needed to find outlets for that capital. Also, in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, it decided that it wanted to a large degree, become less dependent on its kind of relationship with the United States economically. And so it works as, what David Harvey, the geographer, would have called a spatial fix. It soaks up Chinese capital and resources by offering loans that states take up that are then accompanied by Chinese companies coming in and building the material infrastructures. So in that sense, there's certainly an element of truth to that. And as David Harvey would argue, this is a historical pattern that we've seen for many great powers in the past. The other thing that China is very keen on, I think, is a developmental model for the global south. So the export of Chinese knowledge, new technologies, of expertise, and it's been developing this expertise over the last decade in a number of different industries. Leading ones might be the high-speed rail networks that I talked about, 5G, green energy, smart cities, all of these kind of things. So it's a way to develop and to export those ideas, those models and those products. People talk about debt trap diplomacy. I think, so there have been examples of debt trap diplomacy where the investment is unable to be repaid and China comes in and takes over the asset. We've seen that in a number of places. I don't think that's necessarily such a big part of what China has been trying to do here. I think more likely, more important, are the elements of building a parallel diplomatic and institutional system in the way that I talked about earlier. So there are institutions connected with this, so the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. China has also been trying to improve its influence in the United Nations system at various agencies, and has taken on leadership roles in many of those agencies. And so in many respects it's playing a kind of two-level or double game, if you like, I think, of trying to reshape some of the institutions that exist, whilst also building parallel institutions that could be vehicles for the expansion of Chinese norms and values in the future, whilst also building out completely alternative infrastructures. Okay, so I think there are many different sort of complementary elements to this. Ultimately, this is part of a grand strategy aimed at the transformation of international order, but over a very long period of time, in ways that we've forgotten about in democratic societies in the West, with our short-term, electoral cycles or media cycles. The Chinese Communist Party can think over decades, and the Belt and Road Initiative is an example of a great power thinking long-term over decades. And actually, the ability to plan long-term, to play the long game, is something that the United States has forgotten how to do. And it could do it in the Cold War, but it's not doing it now. And I think the Biden administration, to some degree, has started to think in these ways, but it's very difficult because what happens if Trump comes in again next year? And so China, in many respects, has an advantage in what I'm going to call the new geopolitics of infrastructure competition, this ability to plan over the long term. And, tying this together, we can think of it as building the foundations for an alternative, sinocentric international society that can develop over the long term. And of course, when you talk about infrastructures and cities, you don't see these changes overnight. So this is why we can't say, okay, look at this Belt and Road city. This is a Belt and Road city. We can't say that. But what we can say is that these are tendencies that we might start to see emerging in urban context, in infrastructural components, where Chinese norms and values and ideas are starting to find their expression in these material forms. So I'll come on to that in a little while. I just wanted to show you, so one of the interesting sources, some of you will be aware of Rush Doshi's book, The Long Game, which basically kind of is a really very good piece of work that looks at Chinese language sources over a long period of time and sees how the evolution of the discourse has moved in the kind of directions that I was just describing. So from 1989 to 2008, 1989 of course being the collapse of the Soviet Union, a big shock to China about how fast it collapsed and how quickly. And obviously we had Tiananmen Square and all those kind of events. We had a period there of 30 years of China essentially developing within the existing liberal international order, taking advantage of it, trying to develop its economy, walling itself off to some degree, although it joined the WTO in 2000, I think. After the global financial crisis, Doshi sees a big shift, of course. This is, in the period where the Belt and Road Initiative begins to emerge. And this is China going out into the world and being much more assertive. And then from 2017 onwards, he sees this emergence of this notion of great changes unseen in a century. And essentially what this means is that Chinese leaders are starting to think about the balance of power really shifting in a way that they think they can take advantage of. And Donald Trump maybe being the kind of symbol of the terminal decline of US political society, democracy and power. And so that, I think, is something that has been going on. And the Belt and Road Initiative has really been taking advantage of these kind of things, trying to shift towards this notion of a Chinese-led international society. And so there's a lot of talk about the China dream or the Chinese dream, which, to the extent that we can pin it down, seems to be something like a community of common destiny emerging under Chinese leadership in technology, in concepts about international relations. So there's been a relatively kind of recent attempt by China to start to define new security concepts, new development concepts, a new global civilizational initiative. Very sketchy at the moment, not very well worked out. The notion also of an ecological civilization, which seems to be China's attempt to deal with the problem of climate change and also spread international leadership in that area. All of these things have been interesting developments in the past sort of 10 years or so. The other thing, of course, is that China is very, it's very skeptical about the liberal market economy, about the liberal global economy. And it has its own form of state capitalism, as we know at the moment. So there's the rejection of the free market and different models for states and markets that are emerging out of the Chinese context. I'll talk a little bit about those in a while. And so all of these ideas are in the mix here about how China sort of articulates and builds an alternative form of international society. And what we are arguing is the Belt and Road Initiative is the material infrastructure for these ideas, for an alternative Sino-centric international society. And so I think what we also need to think about is this concept of infrastructural power. What is this mechanism by which power is expressed via infrastructure in the past and today before our eyes? Okay. And I think what we could argue is that power and agency are always diffused throughout society in different multi-layered material structures. And we can see these traces, as I said at the beginning. We see them everywhere, in the layout of cities, in the connections between cities and within cities. And equally, of course, what is important here is in the disconnection, in those neighbourhoods and cities and regions that are not connected, in the people that are excluded from these processes and these infrastructures. The design theorist Keller Easterling talks about the notion of disposition, that infrastructure always has a disposition, that it always is political, that it always enables certain forms of agency and closes down others in different ways. And technological systems have disposition. They enable and empower certain social groups. They obstruct other social groups. And we also see the traces of power and agency in the way in which entire regions and nations are linked in the world. And we could say, as an example, the liberal international order that we know is not evenly distributed in terms of its infrastructures and its technologies and its benefits for different groups. So infrastructures are never inert matter. They are intensely political in their design, in their deployment, their capacity to distribute resources unevenly across time and space. So infrastructures intervene to bend time and space, social time and space in different ways. And the other thing I think that is important is that, this is a kind of Foucauldian argument, if you like. They are woven through the very consciousness of individuals, of citizens, setting the conditions for the possibility of agency and understanding. And as the sociologist Bruno Latour was often fond of arguing, technology is society, and society cannot be understood without its technological tools. So we cannot understand one without the other. So what we need to get at is this entanglement between the material and the social, dominant social norms and ideas and values, and the ways that our infrastructures take form and shape, the ways that our cities take shape. And with Latour's argument about society, I think we could also extend that argument to international society and to say that this has perhaps not been well recognized, but international society is no different. It requires a material substrate, an underpinning. And so, significant spates of infrastructure and city building, as we are seeing with the Belt and Road Initiative, or as we saw in the post-World War II period in Europe and America, are rare historical moments of world-making. They shape the fate of millions, if not billions of people over vast reaches of the planet. And such moments are always accompanied by the rise of a new great power as it unfurls its growing influence and wealth, and as previous great powers and their ability to shape external environments decline. And that, I think, is the situation that we are in today with the Belt and Road Initiative. This is another such historically rare moment as China seeks to influence infrastructures and urban forms that will go on to shape the 21st century and incorporate forms of Chinese power and agency in that very shaping. They have the potential to undergird its own form of Sino-centric international society that would accommodate its own evolving norms values and preferences. And they are evolving, they're not fully worked out yet. So what I want to talk about just at the end here is to talk about how we see this in the different urban fragments and infrastructures that we are seeing unfurl along the Belt and Road Initiative. And when I talked about this notion of a disposition, this idea that infrastructures are never neutral, they always incorporate values, politics. What is the disposition of the Belt and Road City? Well, it's hard to know because it's early days. You know, we're talking about 10 years, and as I said, these are developments that take decades to properly unfurl. But we could say that there's an intense focus on logistics and trade. Talked about the, you know, the big kind of railway systems that are being built. There's an emphasis on large transnational urban corridors. There's an emphasis on new urban gateways and empowering cities that were previously disconnected. And in many respects, this is, I think, shifting the nature of the global urban hierarchy over time. So that's another important element. There is an emphasis on surveillance that is drawn from the domestic Chinese context. We'll talk about that again in a moment. There's a notion of developing eco-cities or eco-pilot cities that are related to this concept of ecological civilization that has been emerging. There is an emphasis on Chinese labor doing these projects, building these infrastructures, and alongside that comes the seeding of Chinese expat communities in these different places. And there's also a layering, excuse me, there's a layering onto existing urban forms and histories, as there always must be, because there's never a tabula rasa that you can work on. And so we talk about here, you know, this goes back to what I talked about at the very beginning. We're talking about the assembling of political order from a variety of different fragments. And in the book, we take this journey through the organizing kind of construct of scale. So we go from the very smallest that we see in different contexts around the BRI to the urban layout, to systems of cities, to international institutions, up to the very largest scale of international order. So the tiny fragments, we talk about marketplaces, and we do talk about how, you know, markets have been built in places like Cape Coast with Chinese money incorporating Chinese designs. We talk about buildings. I'll talk about the African Union building in Addis Ababa in a moment. Roads, railways, data centers. Then we go up to the city itself, the urban diagram that urbanists often talk about, up through systems of cities, so national systems, transnational systems, urban corridors, but also city networks. You know, let's not forget what has been happening with global cities over the last 3 or 4 decades. Then the international institutions like the United Nations or the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank I talked about, up to the very biggest element here, which are the norms and values and institutions and that underpin international order. So that's the journey we take through scale, upwards through scale in the book. And these are many of the cities, of course, that we are, so each of these cities are cities that we talk about in the book. And I think one thing you would notice again about these cities is they're not often the types of cities that we would often look to and think about. And again, they're cities that are, you know, largely forgotten or ignored or invisible. And those are the ones that China is in many ways focusing on, because they are the ones in which it can build alternatives in the gaps of the existing system. So these are some of the cities that we talk about in a bit of detail. It's just a selection, there's many of them. Athens, you know, port renovation in Athens with Chinese money, part of the maritime Silk Road. Gwadar City, which I mentioned earlier, a new deep water port that links the Chinese-Pakistan economic corridor with the maritime Silk Road. People talk about this as being a future rival to Dubai. Korgos, which is a dry dock project, the world's largest dry dock, straddles the border of China and Kazakhstan and is a key node in the growing railway network across Eurasia that China has been building, where trains switch to different gauges to travel over the old Soviet infrastructures. And I think what's so interesting about Korgos is that these new railways, you know, many of them were pre-existing infrastructures that were built to service the idea of a Soviet future, right? And so what is happening now is that these existing legacy infrastructures are being redirected from this vision of a Soviet future to support the Chinese dream of a Sino-centric international society. So I find that to be an interesting example. Astana in Kazakhstan is a new financial center connecting Chinese markets to Central Asia, Russia, and Arab financial networks, partly owned by Shanghai Stock Exchange and plugged into the state capitalist style practices that I mentioned earlier, an alternative and growing kind of patchwork of financial infrastructures that are also emerging along the Belt and Road Initiative. Lahore in Pakistan, a new digital smart city. So one of the things that is happening in many cities around the world is that China is exporting what it calls its safe city solutions to BRI partners, utilizing its expertise in surveillance and urban management technologies that have often been trialed in domestic contexts, not least the notorious example, of course, of Kashgar in Xinjiang that we all hear about. The African Union building. So this is another urban fragment built with Chinese money to house the African Union. It has a symbolic resonance. It has actually a symbolic form. It's designed to appear from above as interlocking hands of friendship between African states and China. And China, of course, as we know, has a long history of development leadership in Africa, going back to the Cold War. And then I think the ultimate example of the shifting dynamics here that we could talk about is Hong Kong. So Hong Kong, a preeminent global city in the past, right? An absolutely key node in this network of global cities that underpinned liberal financial order and world markets in the 1990s and onwards. Okay, one of Sassen's original big cities that she talked about as being an important node in this network. We know what has happened in Hong Kong in recent years is that it's to some extent being disconnected from some of these ties of the previous international order and tied into this Belt and Road system, if you like, that China has been building. So we see the character of Hong Kong changing, and we see it increasingly tied into China's domestic system. Is Hong Kong going from being a global city to a Belt and Road city? And there are many other examples that we discuss, lots of them in the book. These are the urban and infrastructural contexts in which China is revealing its influence and the shape that a nascent form of Chinese international society may take. And so our kind of underpinning theoretical argument is that the accumulation of all of these infrastructural and urban fragments are an essential part of the formation of international order and of its transformation as well. That international societies rely upon these material substrates for their durability across time and space. Now I just want to end up very quickly on the idea that what has been happening now, 10 years in, is that other great powers, the US in particular, but also the European Union, have started to realize that they're in a geopolitical competition for influence in the global south, that I'm going to call a new infrastructural geopolitics. That's what is emerging at the moment, and particularly in the last couple of years, and to be honest with you, this has happened to a large degree just at the end of us finishing this book. And so that, I think, is quite an interesting thing in itself. So the reaction. The United States, in recent years, has put a lot of capital behind the idea of the Global Partnership for Infrastructure Investment, which was set up in 2023, was given $30 billion to fund infrastructure projects in developing nations. Now, what is quite interesting about that is it's a small amount of money compared to what has been invested in the Belt and Road. It also ties into things like the Inflation Reduction Act, which gave a lot of money for energy transition projects at home, as we know, but also has a component for extending that abroad. And the CHIPS Act, where we're talking about this kind of decoupling from China that has been talked about in recent years. The European Union also has its own Global Gateway Initiative. Again, only launched last year, This is 300 billion of new money to boost smart, clean and secure links in digital, energy and transport sectors. And so there are two, a lot of where this money is going to go is not obvious as yet and has not been announced, but there have been fairly recently two big projects announced. So the India, Middle East, Europe corridor was announced as a GPII project in September 2023, and the Trans-African Lobito corridor as well. And I think what you would notice about these two corridors is that they're essentially borrowing precisely from the BRI playbook. They're built around big urban corridors. They have transcontinental railways integrated into them. They have strategic maritime components. They have green energy focus. They have a focus on digital connectivity. All of these things come straight out of the BRI playbook. This is the Trans-African Lobito corridor, which does many of the same things. A lot of it is based on getting raw materials out of Africa as well. And so just to conclude, I would say that we are now emerging into this period where the US is scrambling to try to play catch-up with the things that China has been doing, the influence of the Belt and Road Initiative over the last 10 years. As a discipline, as international relations scholars, we are arguing that we need to give more attention to material infrastructure and to cities as components of international order and conduits for the projection of power. The influence over the design and form of cities and their connective tissues is a crucial part of great power, competition and geopolitics. The other thing that I think we would argue is that the Chinese dream of an alternative international order, if it is to be successful, would have to be realized in material form. And that is in infrastructures and that is in cities. And this was a kind of argument that the great urbanist Henri Lefebvre made in relation to capitalism. Capitalism as a socio and economic system has to be given material form. It can't remain abstract. And we see that inscribed in the material places and cities of the world. They take their forms based on the logics and dynamics of capitalism, Lefebvre argued, but also we would argue in terms of great power politics and the values of great powers. And if they don't, and there's no guarantee, of course, that the Belt and Road Initiative will be successful in the way that China wants it to be, then the Chinese dream could dissipate, as many dreams often do. So just as the US has relied on historically specific forms of city, the global city, to carry its own forms of political and economic power and to manifest its own values around the world, so we will find any Chinese-led international society find its expressions in the cities around the world that it influences, that we might eventually come to call the Belt and Road City. Okay, I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Simon. Before I will open the floor for your questions, I have one myself. I want to ask you to come back for a moment to this global city system, because in my understanding, the global cities and those transnational links between global cities are fundamental for the liberal order, right? And you said that, of course, China rejects liberal norms and China tries to influence cities around the world. Not only those, what you said, those forgotten places, like some cities in Central Asia or in Africa, but also cities, such global cities like Hong Kong, right? And my question is, what do you think? Is China able to change such well-established system of global cities and connections between them? And do you think that this change in global order also will affect the well-established cities of a system of global cities?
Yeah. No, it's a good question. I think Dominic and I actually touched on this one as well before the talk. So when I started working on global cities and this idea that global cities were an essential underpinning of part of the liberal international order. This was in the era where the US was still the predominant power, liberal order was relatively stable, and in many ways a lot of the dynamics of global cities was they actually challenged states. They were starting to be big players in global governance. They started to challenge the nature of state sovereignty to some extent. So there are a lot of those are kind of arguments about, is the international system transforming as a result of the dynamics of unleashing these cities, unleashing capital that has grown these cities into enormous and influential players on the world stage. Now, I think what has happened in the last sort of 5 to 10 years, or let's say 10 years now, is that that faith in the future of liberal international order has shifted. So we have rising competition with other great powers that are challenging the liberal international order. At the same time, the liberal international order seems to have lost confidence in itself, and there are intrinsic problems with it as well, such as the vast inequalities that we see in global cities. So there's been a loss of confidence, I think. And so, one of the big arguments that are always made in the past is that for cities of the nature of global cities to actually exist, you required that stable framework underpinned by a US hegemon, essentially. A liberal hegemon was needed for a world of that type to actually exist. It was its condition of possibility. And of course, that is now being challenged from within and without. And so, you could argue again, and I talked about this in the talk, that this is the balance of power shifting. It's having implications for global cities and their networks, and it's also providing conduits for other forms of power as well.
Thank you. Let me pass the mic to the floor. Yes.
Piotr Kozłowski, Warsaw School of Economics. I actually raised my hand quickly because I wanted to build on Tomek's questions. Let me follow suit. First of all, I wholeheartedly agree with the overall premise of your speech. So basically, I'm just going to, target, let's say, the kings, we could say. Yeah. And my first question is, there are going to be a pair of them. Where do you think actually this reclustering, restructuring, we could say, of the global to Belt and Road or tributary, if you want, system of intercity connections is actually real and caused by Belt and Road strategies? Because you gave the case of Hong Kong, but in my view, Hong Kong has been primarily restructured by political violence and not by Belt and Road strategy. And so that's one thing. And so where are those loci, we could say, of where it has been successfully restructured? And this is the ontological part, and then perhaps for a methodological recommendation. What kind of metric would you recommend us to measure such restructuring? I very much agree with revisiting materiality, but what kind of, right? You said infrastructure, but what, FDI, right? Or maybe, let's say, the frequency of railway connections. What is like the right metric to show to us that this interconnectedness is real rather than just postulated? Because with Belt and Road, there's always this problem that, and you probably also signaled this, that the Chinese have the tendency to do, we could say, historical and narrative appropriation, right? They tell stories which are not necessarily meeting the ground. They overpromise, underdeliver, and so, thing is happening, but how to get the real material grasp of it?
Yeah, so, yeah, very good questions. I mean, I feel, in a way, trying to take on something as big as this is always going to be full of holes. It's always going to be full of holes. We're trying to make a new argument here. The Belt and Road itself, as I made this point, during the talk, is that in many respects it's a story, it's a narrative, it's a brand, but also I think it does have real effects in the world. The example of Hong Kong I do agree with you. It's certain, I mean, it's almost like a domestic issue, Hong Kong, rather than a Belt and Road issue. You could argue that. I think what I was trying to portray with that example is that is something that used to be part of an older system and is now, its future is being shifted quite dramatically. And of course, political violence is a part of this, and I didn't go into that in great detail, but there are many elements of the Chinese domestic context that we don't necessarily want to see spread around the world. But I think that is what is happening in many places. So that feeds in a little bit to the metric argument. So, you could see this in many different ways. You could look for solid metrics like railway connectivity and those kind of things. There's a scholar in the US called Zhangming Chen, who is, I don't know if you're aware of his work, but he has mapped a lot of these railways. He's shown how that they remain durable even in relation to the Ukrainian conflict, and that they are creating durable connections between China and many other places that we could say, yes, okay, we can see that's the Belt and Road Initiative in action. Yes, there are metrics. I think you could look at the forms of connectivity. You could look at things that urban scholars look at in terms of world urban hierarchies and connectivity. There was a big argument in the global cities literature for a long time saying, okay, the theory has run ahead of the empirics here. And then there was a big push to do the empirical work. And in many respects, maybe we're replicating that problem. We're going theory, and then we're looking for the empirics to try to back it up. So I do fully appreciate, I think, what you're saying there. I would say also the interesting places that we... So what I wanted to try to hint at in the talk is that the way that we have to see these things is, and I haven't gone into enormous theoretical detail on this, but we need to see the ways in which values are being displayed in the materiality of these kind of things, right? So one example might be the appearance of Chinese eco-city technologies, projects and values, and always saying that technologies are never neutral, so they take on the features of their social context in which they're produced. China has this big thing about eco-pilot cities that's played out in various contexts around China. We could see some of those finding their way into cities around the Belt and Road, and we are seeing some of this because of the fact that Chinese technologies and ways of doing things are being exported along the Belt and Road Initiative. So we see that, I think, in various contexts, and we could see that about other norms and values. So less easy to measure, but also things I think we need to be aware of and to look at. And I talked also about the idea of kind of surveillance technologies being bought by other authoritarian states, being used in other contexts outside of China. And what we're seeing, of course, here is not just China on its own, but the coalescing of other states around the kind of Chinese core of power. So we see it with Russia, even more so in the wake of Ukraine, right? That becoming very dependent on China. The sort of nexus between Iran, Pakistan, China, North Korea, Russia. So we're seeing the emergence of this sort of core of a Chinese-centered international society. So I think I've kind of thrown a few things at the wall there with your question. I think it's a good question. But I think, what I would say is there are different ways to see these effects. Different metrics. Some of them not easy to count, but are, normative. Yeah?
Good morning. Kostas Kourikakis from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. So I understand the relationship you're describing between materiality and ideas, and I find it very convincing, but I have a question about the underlying philosophy behind that. And I'm coming from European Union studies, and there's kind of an understanding that the EU, but also the US, the reason why they provide material support to the rest of the world is because they kind of think of their own ideas as superior, and then trying to get other countries in other parts of the world to like what the EU likes or what the US likes. And I'm wondering if that is the underlying logic behind China's strategy. If it is, that's very Western, I would find it, and ironic in a way that China is following that path. But it could be that China doesn't care to be liked, Even though it represents certain ideas, certain values, maybe it doesn't care if other countries really adopt these values. All it cares about is just getting to win this geostrategic game that you're talking about. Could you talk about that? Do you have any insights into what is? I know it's kind of not easy to tell, but I'd be curious to hear your view on this. Thank you.
Simon, let me collect 2 more questions because we have 5 minutes left and 2 more speakers. So, okay. Dominic.
Well, thank you, Simon, for this very enlightening speech. But my suggestion here is that we're really talking about pre-COVID periods. And in your opinion, to what degree pandemic influenced the Belt and Road cities networks? And to what degree we can come back to the previous period, pre-pandemic? And of course, we all know Russia, war in Ukraine, etc. But from my perspective, as I'm following China's domestic politics more, the centralization of power and zero COVID policy influence the people mindset in China. So from this perspective, in the long term, it might create a kind of a space for being rather introvertic than global. Thank you.
Okay, and the last question.
Thanks a lot. I'm Grant Dawson from the Uni Nottingham Ningbo in China. I have a question that follows on a little bit from the one a few minutes ago about materiality, which seems to be a really core conceptualization for you. My understanding of materiality is that it's kind of about when social relations become sort of settled down and fixed in a society, in a social context. But I get the impression that you're talking about something that's also physical, like real life, concrete and steel and stuff. Can you explain to me what you mean by materiality and how does it drive your analysis?
Right, okay, yeah, so the first one about does China want to be liked, right? I do think, so, you know, what part of this is soft power. So soft power, norms and values. I do think that China, one of its weaknesses actually, is it lacks soft power. And I do think that it does want to, not necessarily be liked. I think China's a very pragmatic country. But it wants to be respected, it wants to be an international leader, and it wants to, I would say, I think it wants to recapture a period of history in which its own domestic values and leadership was respected and followed by other states. And I think it's developing all sorts of ideas about, you know, I showed the sort of new concepts that it wants to project onto the international system that are sort of, in a way, anti-liberal, anti-Western, anti-human rights kind of ideas about development, about civilization, about the relationship with nature. I also think China is in a period of flux where it's trying to renegotiate its relationship with the rest of the world and with its own history, which is incredibly complicated and complex. You know, we know that it's we have a Chinese Communist Party embracing capitalism, a new form of state capitalism, but it's also in recent years been sort of trying to reconnect with its Confucian history and bring ideas from the distant past back in to try to, I think, underpin this notion of international leadership and a new vision of international society. So I wasn't able to talk too much about that, but we talk about it in the book a bit. So I do think, I don't think it wants to be liked, and I don't think these are Western sort of. I do think that they are what great powers do when they emerge as great powers. They want to project their own values, their own institutions onto the international system, and I think that's what China's doing. But in a complex negotiation with its own history and other countries, and at the moment its soft power is probably nowhere near where it wants to be. So I would say soft power is definitely part of this. The pre-COVID, you know, is this all about a pre-COVID era, and are we now in a different place? So I would say my feeling with the pandemic is that you know, people read a lot into what is a short-term lens, I think. So I try to look at sort of longer-term trends. We're looking across the decades here, and I think the pandemic will probably dissipate to some degree in terms of being such a big focus. But that being said, it's definitely had a big impact on China in that period. It's a kind of roadblock in the way in which it was kind of becoming very assertive internationally. But I also don't think, and it slowed its economy, those kind of things, absolutely. So there's definitely a bump in the road due to the pandemic. That being said, I don't see anything that says China's ambitions for changing the nature of international order are going to go away. Quite the opposite. Right? So it's developing these concepts that I talked about. It is still an assertive big player on the world stage. The Belt and Road, I don't think, is going to go away as a there's a lot of talk about, okay, is it done? I don't think so, because I think, again, the way that we think about this is the material component of building international order. So I would say, long term, no, I don't think so. And the last question about materiality and how do we understand materiality? So, yes, we are talking about, real material things like pipelines, internet, data cables, data centers, railways, those kind of things. Absolutely, we're talking about real material things. Your point about social relations being settled and becoming fixed. So that made me think of Bruno Latour, right, and his book on the social shaping of the way that society gets shaped over time, right? And one of his big arguments is that when things like infrastructure become, when they're put in place and they work properly, they become forgotten about, they become invisible. And it's only in moments where they're disrupted or where they're reconstructed that you see the social relations emerge. And so what we want to think about, I think, is we want to think about materiality as always socially shaped and always shaping society in the future. So it gives forms of power and agency. But we also want to think about this being a moment when infrastructure and the social relations that underpin them are in flux. And that makes them visible, that makes them important, that makes them controversies in Latour's kind of language, that immediately are things where we can look at how our social order is unraveling and being reconstituted in some ways. So I hope that answers your question to some extent. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor. Please join me in thanking for this insightful keynote speech.